Home to two of the most talented players on the planet in simple and electronic, Navi has split opinions surrounding their strength at the current time. In this team profile, we're going to separate the fact from the fiction when it comes to the CIS team. So during most of these team profile videos, I'll be talking through the teams map by map, from strongest to weakest, talking about their strengths and weaknesses on each of those maps. But for Navi, we're going to do it a little bit differently, and instead we're going to talk overall about how they play on each side, and then we'll bring in some examples from their map pool to help explain what I'm talking about. So just to briefly talk about their map pool, in my opinion from watching them recently, their map pool right now goes in this order. The best map is Train, then Overpass, Mirage, Inferno, Dust 2, Nuke, and finally Cache. Now Cache is Navi's permaban, and given how their Cache game went versus Astralis, the one time they didn't ban it, I don't expect them to lift their foot on banning it anytime soon in the near future. And also through watching Navi throughout Katowice so far, I think they themselves disagree with the order that I'm saying, and I actually think they banned to their detriment a few times already during that tournament. So we'll start on the terrace side, and before we get into this, I recommend you watch a video I made about Navi's strength on the terrace side. It was particularly looking at some examples on Overpass. I'll have that linked in the description. Now, to all four of you that actually watched that video, you're already in good stead, but for the rest of you, check it out if you would like to. So the first topic I want to delve into is all about the economy game. Now on the terrace side, Navi love to play very, very aggressively with regards to the economy, and on the second round, on the T side, they lose pistol but get the bomb plant, they will almost always get those AKs out, and then try to work from there. Now what Navi wants to do on the terrace side, almost always, is break that CT money, and they will then rack up rounds as their opponents are forced to take multiple ecos. So in my opinion, Navi are the best team in the world at playing on low buys and force buys on both sides of the map, but for now we're just going to focus on T. So what might be asking yourself, why is this the case? And I think there are three reasons why this happens, and this is team play, calling, and their individual skill. So for team play, I think Navi are often overlooked. I think they're almost always overlooked in like the general community. And in terms of their micro team play, in terms of trading, knowing the angles, contacting, and for map control, I have no doubt in my mind that Navi is world class. Now on force buys and low buys, you're going to have low nades, and this sort of team play then becomes very, very important, because this is how you actually take map control. When you have low nades, you just trade into areas. The good examples of this are brackets on Inferno, mid and long on Overpass, and mid on Mirage. Navi are so good at taking these areas of the map when they have low nades and just contacting into them, but working so well together to make sure that they're safely doing that, and they can just find the trade kills if the CTs are trying to contest that control. So in terms of calling, I think Zeus from the community gets a lot of flack, but on force buys at least, I think his calling is really, really good. He just keeps the round simple. He knows which areas of the map, just contact him for map control, and what other areas he should be using the utility. And if there is an AWP in play, he's actually really good at anticipating where that AWP is and using their utility effectively to isolate that AWP. Now, another aspect tied in with this calling, as I just mentioned, is anticipating where these opposing AWPers are, and also if they have an AWP in the first place. Now, if Navi knows you do not have an AWP on the CT side, they are much, much more likely to force buy, and they love force buying in these scenarios, because it makes it all the easier to just contact and trade into areas for map control, and they really flourish in this scenario. So the third reason I mentioned was their individuals. Now, if I'm force buying second round after losing pistol, and I've only got one AK, then simple and electronic are certainly up there in the world for the players I want to give that AK to. I don't think I can name 5 players on the planet that I'd rather have the AK in that situation to try and crack open a round and win us this force buy scenario. And on so many occasions on these force buys and low buys, you'll just see simple and electronic being put into good situations, but crucially they find the entry kill, they crack open a bomb site, and it's really their individual prowess that gives Navi a chance in a lot of these rounds. But equally, they do play around them, they put them in these positions, and the teammates are working with them to trade them out, all these sorts of things. So in terms of the double-edged sword of aggressively buying, I don't actually have much of an issue with how Navi aggressively buys on the terror side, considering how good they are on these low buys, but there are certainly scenarios where just repeatedly force buying on the T side is not a good idea. And one that comes to mind is when they're playing on T side of Train into double AWPs. You're not going to have a lot of fun force buying with low nades and these sorts of things, because you're just not going to be able to get out of the areas of the map onto the bomb site without meeting those orbs and just taking so many casualties. And certainly on train, I've seen them overforce a few times and take themselves out of the match. The next topic we're going to talk about on the terrorist side is how simple and electronic fit as star players into the overall approach of the team. Now on the terrorist side, it's pretty clear to me that simple and electronic are given a lot of space to make plays, and I'm not actually sure whether it's Zeus calling this or it's them calling it, saying they want to make this play, I've got the spawn, I want to do this. Yeah, I'm not really sure of the divide between Zeus and them being calling, but regardless, within the games they do definitely are given a lot of space to do what they like. Now the way I want to frame this kind of philosophy to play in the game, I'm going to frame it versus how Liquid and Astralis tend to play. So if Liquid and Astralis spots an opening or a gap in the opposing CT side, they'll often use a practice round to exploit that. An example I'm going to use here, kind of a made up example, you don't really see this very much, but say we're playing Terrorist Overpass and say our opponents are not early mollying a monster. Now Liquid and Astralis, I'd bet heavily they do have fast monster hits in their wheelhouse, and they'll just throw in a fast monster execute to exploit this. They'll just come straight out monster with some flashes, heaven smoke, mid-sight smoke, barrels molly, this sort of thing. They'll just use a set execute, a set round to exploit this. The difference is that I think Navi, whereas they might run a similar execute, but I think what's actually more likely is that Electronic, who's the player that defaults that area of the map, he'll know that and he'll say to Zeus, come with me, just flash me out of monster early and I'll take a fight versus the barrels player. And more often than not in that scenario, he is going to find the entry kill and crack open the round. So this is a very small and simplified example, but I think this is kind of generally how Navi exploits gaps in the CT side. It's not always they have an incredible set round, it's more that it kind of stems from the individuals and they're saying there's a gap here, come with me, help me exploit this. So another example that comes to mind is on Terrorist Inferno. So most teams will throw in a set fast banana contest, a couple rounds and a half when they have the right spawns on the right players, but they just smoke the close molly and throw some flashes, this sort of thing. I can't actually recall Navi really ever running these sort of rounds. I'm sure they have sometimes, but it's not a staple part of their terrorist side. Inferno, I think what you see more is stuff like Simple just taking his AWP on a good spawn, getting out front logs and trying to contest it that way. Because you can see there's kind of this different idea behind how you kind of approach the game, is that it stems more from the individuals in Navi compared to other teams where it's more of an entire team-based approach. And just to point out, it's not that I think the way Navi approaches this kind of terrorist play is better or worse, it's just different from Liquid and Astralis, and in some ways it probably allows them to adapt faster because you don't need the whole team to be on board, you just need one player to notice one thing and call one thing and this sort of thing. And I can guarantee for the CT sides playing against them, it's an absolute nightmare to play against. So moving on, what are the weaknesses of Navi on the terrorist side? Now if they fall out of economic control, I think Navi has more issues than say Liquid or Astralis, perhaps even MIBR now they're looking a bit improved. I think they'll rely quite heavily on just sort of winning 2v3, 3v4 sort of scenarios with just using their individuals rather than having a really great play to get them into great after plant scenarios and this sort of thing. I think the reason for that is if Navi is forced into playing more structured with more utility, they just don't have the same depth playbook as a Liquid, as an Astralis, these sorts of teams. And a good example of this would be Terrorist Train. Now most teams would have a bunch of rounds that they can run, perhaps using the sandwich E-box smokes, perhaps some innovative stuff like, I don't know, fast main Ivy splitting, some fast B execs perhaps, I'm not really sure. But in that sense, I don't really see Navi do this sort of thing very often. And in that sense, it's actually quite a surprise that Navi are so good at train when they don't have so many set rounds. Perhaps food for thought. I'm not exactly sure why. It's probably because they're just so experienced on the map and they're kind of, they are really actually quite good at playing default on train and this sort of thing. So let's move on to the counter-terror side. Now relative to the other top teams, so the teams we're really talking about here is Liquid, Astralis and MIBR, I do think they're actually quite a bit weaker on average than those teams on the CT side. And again, we're going to start here by talking about the economy game. So the first thing to understand is that Navi's aggressive buy patterns are not restricted to the terrorist side. And I can recall many occasions where Navi force way too hard on the CT side of maps. And in a similar sense, I can't recall many times where they've actually taken hard double ecos. They normally full force if they get reset. And that means in 2 rounds time, they're only going to have a 4,300 buy. And they might even lose that round as well. So before we get talking about the negatives of this approach, let's talk about the positives of Navi's force buys on the CT side. Now, I think their CT calling around force buys is the best on the planet, actually. Importantly, they actually understand that there's no point just sitting in a standard setup when you don't have as good weaponry, when you don't have the nades, because you just can't play out a standard round. You have to take calculated risks to throw in some CT aggression, these sorts of things. And Zeus is really good actually at calling these sorts of rounds. And I think Navi has set the standard actually for how you call rounds on low economy on the CT side. Again, this is another case where having some of the best individual players comes in pretty handy. When you only have a couple of rifles on the CT side, you just give it simple and electronic, tell them to go for this sort of aggression, and they stand a better chance than most of pulling it off. So whilst Navi is very good at playing these rounds, the problem is that they force themselves out of games. They just force way too hard sometimes, and they seem to do it pretty much on every map, but Dust 2 is probably the example that sticks in my head for where they're the worst culprits of overforcing. And an example that sticks in my mind was during the E-League Premier semi-final versus Team Liquid, where they got absolutely blown out on the CT side of Dust 2 versus Liquid in this match. They actually picked into Dust 2, so it was even worse in that sense in the series. It's because they just kept buying on the CT side. They never had double ops, never had full nades. They couldn't take long control properly, and they couldn't sit back on double ops, which is what you want to be doing on the counter-terrorist side of Dust 2. It's another aspect of how Navi plays the CT side. I think this topic actually gets mispainted quite a lot. Is taking risks with their setup, stacking sometimes at the start of round of this sort of thing. So before we get into this, I'm going to direct you to another video that I made on Navi's calling on CT overpass, and another one I made on Dust 2 long and how it spawns mind games. Both will be linked below, but this is again this idea of calling kind of risky CT setups, overstacking sites, these sorts of things. Now Navi is not scared to call heavy stacks and take risks in leaving one site under man during the early round. I think people mispaint these calls as just blind risk when there certainly is a thought process behind them. And in the server, it's extremely difficult actually if you're playing against a team that likes to do this sort of thing to actually call their bluff. And you need actually quite a lot of balls to say, I think they're only playing one player on this site right now. Let's try and risk it and go through, because if you get it wrong, you're probably going to lose the round. So overall, how do they approach CT side? How does Navi approach CT side? So in terms of well-practiced takes of map control, I don't rate Navi as up there particularly. I think they've added some stuff from what I can see so far during the major, but it's still not on par with some other teams. MIBR, he's back with the old lineup, Liquid and Astralis, they've all got much more in terms of CT aggression, really structured CT aggression, taking map control away from those terrorists. So on CT Inferno, it's one that always sticks in my mind. They have to be one of the worst teams in the top 8 or so over the past 6 months of taking CT banana control. And if I was certainly part of this team, if I was coaching this team, this would be a big focus coming into the major, was to try and fix this, because it's something that's been haunting them over the past 6 months, and it's probably a big part in why they've had really weak results actually on Inferno in the past 2 or 3 months. This sort of period, they've really tailed off, whereas last year, about a year ago now, 8 months ago now, they were really good on Inferno, potentially even the best on the planet. Now on a map like Overpass, the highlights of how Navi play is definitely simple and electronic, playing aggressively towards that mid and fountain area. They're really good, and they're such a nightmare to deal with for the other teams. And I'm sure many other teams really hate playing Overpass because of these two players on the CT side. Now I think that Navi's team fundamentals in a micro and macro sense on the CT side are pretty good. They actually don't make many massive mistakes, which might surprise some people. They really are quite refined in terms of their fundamentals on the CT side. And as is the case on the Terror side, I think people overlook just how good of a team Navi is in terms of getting all the basics and the team play right. And keep in mind, they really wouldn't have remained a top 3 team for so long. They actually are a decently consistent team. They're not incredibly consistent, but they'll never fall below. Well, the Ice Challenge wasn't good, but apart from that, I don't think they'll really ever fall below a top 8 sort of level. And they really wouldn't have done this if they had glaring flaws under the surface of lacking team play, not having great fundamentals, this sort of thing. Though there's a couple more things I want to mention before we round this one out, and that is that while Simple in my eyes definitely is the best player in the world and has been for maybe a year at this point or something like this, CT Nuke always seems to be a problem child for him. He's never been able to have the impact that he has on other maps, and I'm not really sure why it is. When you have other AWPers, Device, Kenny S for example, that do really thrive on the CT side of Nuke, and I'm not sure why it is. Perhaps it's just simply because he just doesn't play Nuke enough to flush it out as much as he does on other maps. Perhaps it doesn't allow as many aggressive playmaking opportunities he potentially wants on the CT side, but for whatever reasons, he just doesn't have the same impact he does on other maps. And I think this is a decent chunk, not enormous, but a decent reason why Navi's never really found their footing on Nuke. It's never really progressed up their map pool terribly far, and they've never really been able to compete consistently with Astralis or perhaps Mousesports towards the middle of last year when they were getting really good on Nuke. So that summarise what we talked about. I think Navi is actually mispainted quite a lot by the community, and as a team, I do think they actually have a fair amount of structure, and I've always thought their team plays pretty good. And I think perhaps where people think they're just terrible, they're just making massive mistakes, is potentially actually in the mental game. So in this team, they have some really fiery personalities, and I think we've all seen that. If you've seen any clips of them, if you've heard any clips of their team speak, I mean, Zeus can get pretty wild, and of course, Simple's had a pretty tainted past on that sort of front. And I think Navi can mentally fall out of games sometimes. It doesn't happen that often, but certainly if they're down, if they're decently down, if they're 14-5 down, I don't think they really have a chance of winning the game because they're normally just mentally out of it at that point. They just don't really care. And I've certainly seen that happen quite a few times. Anyways, how do you think Navi is going to perform in the playoffs? And why don't you comment below with your thoughts on just that topic? If you enjoyed that, why don't you hit that like button, get subscribed, follow me on Twitter, all the good stuff. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.